Giora Eiland is a retired Israeli Major General and former head of Israel's National Security Council. He was the chief architect of an often-cited controversial war strategy on Gaza, presented to the Israeli government in April last year, that's become known as the General's Plan, or the Eiland Plan, for evacuating northern Gaza, imposing a complete siege, denying food, water and other supplies, civilians remaining treated as combatants, with the aim of driving out Hamas, securing the release of hostages and bringing about the militant surrender. And after that, maintaining indefinite Israeli control until a new Palestinian Authority could be established outside of Hamas. Now, this was considered by the Knesset. The Prime Minister's office officially denied adopting the plan. So analysts suggesting that a course of the past year, there have been significant overlaps with the evacuation orders and the restriction of aid since October last year, and the complete blockade in March to May this year, which the UN described as near starvation conditions for the population. Well, General Eiland has been critical since of the conflict. He's written an editorial in the Israeli press this week titled "A High Price Without Victory." The whole world wants the war to end, he said, except the Israeli government. And as you can see a moment ago, Major General Giora Eiland joins us from Israel. Welcome to France 24, Major General. Thank you for coming on the programme this evening. And we're going to move to your view of the conflict coming up. But I first want to get your thoughts on the General's Plan and how it came about.
The General's Plan was my plan. Actually, I presented it to the Israeli Defense Forces immediately after the beginning of the war, almost 2 years ago. Please keep the map because I have to explain it and use this illustration.
We can see it, yeah.
Yes, and what I suggested was the following one. The most important area of Gaza is the northern part, not only because this is the center of Hamas, including the city of Gaza. Please keep the map because I have to use it. And I cannot explain it with this other footages. So please keep the map on, and I will be able to explain it very, very briefly.
We'll show them now. We're bringing the map back up for you, Major General.
More than that, this area is the closest area to many, many Israeli towns and villages. The distance between some of the villages in Gaza to the Israeli villages is less than half a mile, or let's say 800 meters, something that can be crossed by foot in 5 minutes and by car or motorcycle by 1 minute, as we could see it very well on the 7th of October. And here what I suggested. At that time, Israel accomplished the what we call the Sarim corridor, which is this is the red corridor that is, we can see it on the map, and that divides Gaza into two parts, the northern part and the southern part. Now, what I suggested at that time is that Israel will tell all the population that live in the northern part of Gaza, hundreds of thousands of people, that they are advised to leave this area through safe passages to more the southern part. If they want to leave, they can leave. If they want to stay, they can stay. But from a certain moment, Israel will prevent any supply of food and water. By the way, Israel is continuing to supply water to all places in Gaza, including to this area. Anyway, Israel would stop to supply water and supply to this area. So those who will choose to stay there, assumingly maybe mainly terrorists, at some point will have the choice either to surrender or to starve or to die in starvation. By doing so, we don't need to attack anyone. We don't have to use any bomb. We don't have to do anything that is dangerous to the population, and it is not dangerous to our forces. And if we capture this area, then it might create a huge pressure on Hamas that at least would be ready to negotiate about the release of the Israeli hostages. Yeah. Why? Because this is the most important land of Gaza, and as far as the leadership of the state of Gaza is concerned, lives of people are not important, but land has a lot of significance. By the way, this plan is fully consistent with the international humanitarian law, and I copied, listen to this, I copied this principle from the Pentagon, from the DOD manual, how to carry out a siege. And the siege is more than permissible if you give the civilian population the time and the access to leave this area because you enforce a complete siege. And that's what I proposed at that time. Unfortunately, the government did not accept it. and we could see the results, which are far from being, let's say, good for either side.
I'm going to get to that point in a moment with you, Major General. Let's first just look at what the aim was for the longer-term plan. After the initial objectives, the plan for the day after, as it were, what was the transition to? Was it, while it was under indefinite Israeli control, was it for the Israelis to settle? Was it for Palestinians to eventually return?
No. Look, I can speak about my plan, my intent. I'm not responsible for different interpretation of other people. My plan was to, let's say, to take this land, number one, because it is essential in order to be able to return the Israeli civilians who used to live in the settlements or the villages and the towns around this area to return to their homes. Many of them say, we cannot return to our homes because when I come back to my home, and I can see in a range of few hundred meters, the people in the area that where they came, they actually killed my family, killed my friends, killed my neighbors. I will not be able to return. So one of the main reasons why I proposed it, is in order to persuade the Israeli people who live around this area that they have a better security conditions to return. And number two, which is more important, to create a real leverage on the leadership of Gaza to understand that if they do not accept certain conditions, they will lose more and more land. And as I said earlier, lives is not important to these leaders, but land as, let's say, holy, let's say, significance. That's what I proposed at that time. As I said, it is probably not relevant today. I don't know why we speak about this
matter. It comes in because there's a lot of mysticism over it. It's become often cited, and also it's very important to hear from you, given that it was your plan. It also takes us to events today, and because also the plan, Major General, reportedly deeply split the cabinet at the time. You had the hard-right politicians, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who were for it and who wanted Israel settlers to be able to move and saw a pathway to permanent Israel control. And then the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, opposing it, quoted as saying he rejected long-term Israeli rule over Gaza. And what subsequently has happened, how much do you think of your plan has influenced what's followed, and has there been a partial implementation, do you think?
No, unfortunately not. And what Israel is planning to do, or at least according to the thoughts of the Minister of Defense, Israel is planning to do something which is entirely opposite to my plan. They want to concentrate a lot of Palestinians in certain areas in southern Gaza and to be responsible for them. And this is exactly opposite to my plan. My plan was to avoid Israeli responsibility, and as I said, is to take a land, but not to have a people there. And we have to remember that in the wars of the 21st century, actually it began more than 6 years ago, if you want, in the French let's say, experience in Vietnam, and then the Americans in Vietnam, the Israelis in Lebanon, the Americans and British in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Russians in Afghanistan back in the 80s, all of them have a very similar lesson and conclusion. You cannot have an area where the military forces are deploying among hostile population, because whenever there is hostile population, there will be always guerrilla people or terrorists who will fight against you, and they will cause you several, or I would say significant damage. That's why you don't want to have your soldiers so close to civilian population.
Yes.
My plan was to create a real distinction and a real difference between the Israeli forces and the other people. What the government is planning to do is to do exactly the opposite, so there is no connection whatsoever between my plan, which unfortunately is not relevant today, to what the government might be planning today. But I think that this new plan of the Minister of Defense is not going to be implemented. There is a strong rejection everywhere in Israel to this plan, including the military establishment, because it is, let's say, a stupid plan. So I don't think that it is going to be carried out. Yeah. And I will say more than that. I'm among the, let's say, 74% of the Israelis who believe that the right way to end this war is to agree to a simple formula of end of the war, withdrawal of the Israeli forces today, only for exchange of all the Israeli hostages, the live and the dead, that are still kept in Gaza. More than that, and this is the last point, more important, The real question all along this war is what is going to be on the day after? Who is going to control Gaza? And about 4 months ago, the president of Egypt came with an offer, and he said the right solution for Gaza for the day after to replace Hamas is that the Arab moderate states led by Egypt will take control of Gaza and will be responsible for the reconstruction of Gaza. I thought at that time when he said it in real time, I'm still thinking that this is the right formula. And the only condition that Israel should put on the table if we endorse this Egyptian proposal is that any reconstruction of Gaza depends or should depend on demilitarization of Gaza. In other words, yes, let's reconstruct Gaza, but at the very same time, let's make sure that there is no weapons and military forces in Gaza. I think that Israel should have accepted this deal 4 months ago. And again, I do criticize the Israeli government for not listening to some of the good advisors that we get from others.
Well, let's step to that. I mean, I want to talk about a number of things you've just raised there. First of all, I know you've said before you think this is the most complicated warfare anywhere in the world in comparison to the likes of Afghanistan and Iraq because of the vulnerability of the population and the tunnels, the ability of Hamas to embed themselves. We don't take that away from the difficulty of this conflict. And at the same time, you're talking, there are many analysts that will point to similarities, the March to May blockade of food going in and major areas being evacuated to the kind of ideas that you had, to the starving of the area to bring out Hamas. Now, you must be aware of the international condemnation from the UN, human rights organisations, of your plan at the time of prohibiting allowance of food as a weapon violates international law, forcible transfer of the population. Well, let me quote it to you. So you have Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the ICC.
I understand what you're referring to.
Forcible transfer.
Listen, because this is
But these are important issues.
Distinction.
Of course they are. And starvation, let me just briefly mention Article 8 of the Rome Statute classifies intentional starvation of civilians as a war crime in international armed conflicts. What would you say to that?
Okay. Now, this is true as long as you occupy area and then you are responsible for the population and you have to prevent any starvation and any other, let's say, misery from the civilian people. However, and this is a very important point, let's assume that on one Saturday morning, the very small country of Luxembourg invaded France, killed 1,200 people, most of them are civilians, kidnapped 250 people, and in this way began a war. I can assume that the first action that the government of France will take would be to stop any supply that is coming from France or from the ports of France to Luxembourg. And the government of France would probably say the following sentence: look, we are going to blockade and to block any supply from our area to your area, at least until you return unconditionally all the Israeli hostages that you captured. And this is more than legitimate. I mean, during a war, listen to this, during a war, before I enter the area of the other side, before I occupy it, before I become responsible for the people, I don't have any obligation to supply energy and food and other material to the state that attacked me. It does not make any sense, and it is not mentioned in any international document. So before we invaded Gaza, and that's what I proposed on the very first day of the war, since Gaza is de facto war that began a war against Israel, there is no reason that we will supply them all that they need. And we could say on the very first day, look, the only real advantage that Israel have over Gaza is that we are controlling the passages to Gaza. So instead of continuing to supply water, energy, fuel, and other things to Gaza, we will stop it until you return the Israeli hostages, which is the most important humanitarian problem. That's what I proposed, and it is, as I emphasize, fully consistent with the international humanitarian law, contrary to some other interpretations of others.
That's your interpretation.
And that's what we should have
I
done.
understand that's your interpretation, Major General, and you give the what would happen if they did this, but it comes back to the point to face in a court of law, not with me, ultimately, about the Rome Statute, Article 8 of starvation, classifying intentional starvation of civilians as a war crime. That has to be looked at, even with the proportionality effect of trying to seek out and bring about a Hamas surrender. Now, if we look at your situation now, this op-ed that you spoke about this week that you've brought out in the Israeli press, you've said you want the war to end. Quote, occupying a civilian area gives a false impression of success and drags the army into a costly quagmire.
Look, if you occupy area, you have full responsibility. And by the way, Israel never stopped the supply of the most important essential material to Gaza, and this is water. And as far as I know, the flow of food to Gaza and other material continues, which of course it is taken advantage by Hamas, that Hamas is getting all this food. They take control of all the supply. They get it for free, and they resell it for very elevated price to the people of Gaza. Hamas is not short of any of this supply. They simply keep it and resell it to the people and make the people miserable as possible. And that's the way how they make a fortune, something that enables them to continue and of course draft more people and buy more weapons and other things which are essential for the war. So this is complicated the matter, and I never said that when you are occupying an area, you should prevent the people who live there from this essential material. I never said it.
But
and what
you talked about civilians once you've evacuated them, if they return, or if they don't evacuate, they are combatants.
Look, as I said, going back to what you quoted as the general plan, I never mentioned that the people who leave the northern part will suffer for any lack of supply. The only thing that was important for me is to take this land and to have it is under Israeli control without the presence of the population. You cannot, as I said earlier, you cannot control an area with hostile population and to expect no casualties on your side. That's what I proposed. So whatever I propose along all the way is fully consistent with the law of the armed conflict, and I don't think that there is any problem here. However, due to the mistakes that the Israeli authority made along this past 21, 22, actually almost 22 months, the only real way to, let's say, to stop the misery of both sides is, as I said, to agree one-to-one simple deal. Give us back all the Israel hostages, and we will stop the war and withdraw from Gaza. But the day after should be controlled by the Arab countries like Egypt and others, and not by Hamas. This is the proposal, and I think that this is the right proposal that most of the international community should support. Now, everybody is looking at the misery of the people of Gaza, and of course it is understandable. What about the poor Israeli hostages that are still there, that no one takes care from them?
Yes.
They don't get anything. Many of them, about 46, if I'm not wrong, already perished in captivity in Gaza. So this is also a humanitarian problem that should be resolved, and it is totally ignored by Youth Network and by many other European.
Well, here's the thing, and let me report this back to you, because I've seen a copy of the General's report, which looks to be real, which talks about denying food, water and other supplies during this complete siege of the north. Civilians remaining would be treated as combatants. Are you saying that now that wasn't the plan on denying food wasn't there in the first place?
Civilians will be given the chance and the time to leave this area.
But my issue is about food. You said they wouldn't be denied food.
Listen to this. No, but they will go to other area where they will get everything. Don't
But that's not in the north. If you remain in the north, essentially legally.
But in the northern. But the whole idea is that in the northern part there will be no people. Israel wants to conquer this area, which is legitimate during war, but we don't want to have population there for obvious reasons. That's why I proposed, and I said exactly, if you want, I will send you the document, the American manual that suggests exactly what I suggest whenever a siege becomes to be, let's say, reasonable, permissible, or even advisable tactics in order to gain some, let's say, military objectives. That's what I propose.
Major General,
so don't try to claim that my proposal was to keep the people there and to bring them to starvation.
I'm trying to find clarity.
I said it only in regard to the terrorists. to the terrorists who will choose to remain in this area and to continue fighting us.
My purpose, Major General, is to get clarity from you. That's why I wanted to speak to you. And your point about food, that means food for those who decide to move, that go with the evacuation order, which takes us to this week. This takes us to this idea proposed by Israel Katz this week of a humanitarian city, quote, in the rubble of Rafah, intending to relocate the population, concentrate them in Gaza, and they would not be allowed to leave in the plan except through voluntary emigration. What do you make of that?
As I said, it is a stupid plan, and I don't think that it is going to be implemented. It doesn't serve any of the real Israeli interests whatsoever. In this case, it might create, let's say, a humanitarian crisis, which is not really needed. And the Israeli soldiers who are supposed, according to this plan, to provide the food and the supply to the people, certainly will suffer from a lot of casualties, because among the hundreds of thousands of people who will be there, there will be a lot of combatants who will choose to fight against us. So I'm definitely against this plan. I'm not the only one. And as I said earlier, I have good reasons to believe that this plan will not be implemented.
A final thought, Major General. I was talking to the former Israeli Prime Minister not long ago, Ehud Olmert, who said he believes war crimes have been committed by Israel in the attempt to bring back hostages and destroy Hamas. What do you think?
I think that it was a poor statement of the former Prime Minister. I know him very, very well. I used to work for him. I was the head of the national security under him for at least several months. And I think that he is trying to achieve what everybody or many people in Israel wants to achieve, and this is the end of the war. However, the way that he described the activities of the IDF there is wrong. I don't think that the Israeli forces intentionally kill civilians. I don't think that the Israeli forces intentionally create, let's say, misery and terrible let's say, results to the people in Gaza. I have a lot of figures that can prove it. For instance, contrary to your, let's say, to your claim, most of the people who have been killed in Gaza are civilians. So let's put it in this way. The ratio between civilians and the combatants in Gaza is much better than all other, let's say, similar cases in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. So I think that we are very, very careful. Of course, we do make mistakes. Mistakes cannot be fully prevented. The people and the combatants are mixed together. Hamas is using the civilians as human shields. It is very hard to make a real distinction between the two. You have sometimes to have a real surgical ability to kill only those that you want to kill and not to kill the others. And I think that generally speaking, we do it successfully and carefully, although I do agree there are a lot of civilian casualties. Unfortunately, this is the nature of this kind of war, and you cannot completely prevent it.
Yeah, you give the figure a ratio of 1-to-1, Major General, which is a figure that has been quoted by some Israeli sources. It's not an internationally recognised figure. The UN Humanitarian Agency and Human Rights Agency, last on the verified study, say it's more like 70% civilians and 30% Hamas militants, and more than 58,000 people killed. And I know this is Hamas figures, but UN say that is likely to be underestimated. There's still people under the rubble. And you give the quote on other comparisons. I think from the top of my head, the Afghan conflict from 2001 to 2021, around 180,000 people reported to have died there. That's a different comparison that you're making, isn't it? A much, much longer time period.
Look, let's agree as a compromise that proportion between civilian and combatants is 2-to-1. Let's say 2 civilians are killed for every terrorist, 2-to-1. What are the proportion in Iraq and Afghanistan? According to the most conservative, I would say, assessment, it is 3.7-to-1. And the conditions and the circumstances and the difficulties in Gaza are by far more complicated than those that existed in Afghanistan and Iraq. Only in Mosul, the United States and other allies killed 11,000 civilians in Mosul. Now, ISIS was a joke. ISIS was not a real military organization. They don't have sophisticated weapons like Gaza. They did not enjoy the support of the people like the Hamas in Gaza. Certainly, they did not have 700 kilometers of tunnels, etc. And nevertheless, in reasonable or in real, let's say, professional comparison, they kill much more civilians than what we did if we make some comparison in terms of specific locations. So I don't think that I don't think that the Israeli armed forces is behaving very different or not different at all from what we could see from other Western countries during the wars. The circumstances in Gaza are by far more complicated, and it leads to some results which are, of course, very unfortunate results.
Yeah, Major General, thank you. Israel does face a case of alleged genocide brought by South Africa to the International Court of Justice. Benjamin Netanyahu faces allegations of war crimes at the International Criminal Court, which they both state and Prime Minister vehemently deny. Thank you for your time, Giora Eiland, Major General, for speaking.